Okay, so our first speaker is Dr. Ira Helfand, who's worked for many years as an emergency room physician and now practices internal medicine at an urgent care center in Springfield, Massachusetts. He's a past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility and is currently the co-president of its global federation, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. He has published on the medical consequences of nuclear war in the New England Journal of Medicine, the British Medical Journal, and Medicine and Global Survival, and is the author of the report Nuclear Famine, 2 Billion People at Risk. IPPNW was the recipient of the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. And I know Ira through our work in ICAN. I Can Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which is moving very rapidly to get a new kind of treaty, which I think you'll talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. So I want to talk to you today about nuclear war. We've obviously a very strongly shared conviction amongst the people here that we need to avoid war in general. But I think when we're talking about nuclear war, the urgency is perhaps even greater. Back in the 1980s, we all understood the extent of the nuclear threat that we faced. And we understood that nuclear weapons could destroy human civilization and possibly destroy our species. That understanding has largely vanished from the world. With the end of the Cold War, people concluded incorrectly that the danger had gone away and really stopped thinking about it. And that includes many of us who are in the peace activist community as well. But of course, as we know, at some level, the danger did not go away. There are still about 15,000 nuclear warheads in the world, the vast majority in the arsenals of the United States and Russia. And there are 7 other nuclear weapon states as well. And we have learned in recent years several things that are quite alarming. One is that it would not take necessarily a full-scale war between the United States and Russia to destroy human civilization. A much more limited conflict could do that. And number 2, we have learned that our world is changing in other ways that are very destabilizing. Particularly, and I'm not going to talk about this a lot today, but we'll be talking about it tomorrow more in the workshop on this subject. Climate change is putting increasing stress on the entire planet and dramatically increasing the danger of conflict, including the risk that conflict will escalate to nuclear war. So I think it's very important for us to understand fully the extent of the threat that are posed by these weapons. And I want to start by talking about a limited nuclear war, the kind of scenario that we are just now starting to take into account. We've looked particularly at the consequences of a war between India and Pakistan. And I think most of us are familiar with this image of Hiroshima, in the words of the Red Cross representative, Dr. Junot, wiped clean by the bomb that fell on the city. What we need to understand is that this image cannot serve for us as a model of the danger that we face. In a future nuclear war, it's not going to be one small bomb on 1 or 2 cities. It's going to be many weapons, many times larger, and the destruction is going to be far greater than anything that we can sum it up from looking at pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thanks. I was told I had to stand up close to it. Thank you. So we've looked at the scenario particularly of a war between India and Pakistan for a number of reasons. These are 2 nuclear-armed states that have fought a number of wars since their independence in the 1940s, and which are engaged in a very aggressive nuclear arms race at the moment. Both sides are expanding their arsenals. Furthermore, there is fighting frequently on the line of demarcation between them in Kashmir, fighting which is rarely reported here in the United States. And so there's a real potential that a war could take place there. We considered a scenario in which India and Pakistan each use just 50 Hiroshima-sized bombs against the other side. That's less than a half of their available nuclear arsenals. And what we found is really horrible. Directly in South Asia, the bombs, the explosions, the fires, the radiation kill over 20 million people. large areas of the continent are contaminated with radioactive material. This is a disaster really unprecedented since the end of the Second World War were it to happen. But these direct local effects are just a small part of the story, because what happens is that the fires started by these nuclear explosions put enormous amounts of soot into the atmosphere, and they cause worldwide climate disruption. In fact, the temperature across the planet drops about 1.3 degrees centigrade on average, and that decline lasts for about a decade. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, 1.3 degrees. But this table, this graph, shows in blue all of the warming that's taken place in the last 130 years, the global warming which we're all so worried about. And the red line at the right of the slide shows the cooling that takes place in just 3 days after this nuclear war. The result of this is a huge interruption of food production around the planet. We've studied closely what happens to food production in China, and looking at the 3 most important grain crops. And as you can see, there are significant declines that last for a whole decade. In the case of maize, corn, and middle season rice, declines in the range of 15, 16, 17%. In the case of winter wheat, which is the second most important food crop in China, the decline is a staggering 31% over an entire decade. And in the first 5 years, it's nearly 40% of the crop is lost. Now, the world simply is not in a position to absorb this kind of decline in food production. World grain reserves at the current moment amount to only about 90 days of consumption. There's enough grain stored in reserve to feed the planet for 90 days. That's all. And this famine is going to last for a decade. Furthermore, at baseline today, there are a large number of people who are already malnourished, about 795 million according to the most recent UN estimates. These people receive on average about 1,700 calories a day, which is just enough for an average adult to maintain his or her body mass and to do a little bit of work, to grow food or to gather food. This entire population would be at risk if food production decreased to even 10%. They simply cannot afford to have a further decrease in the amount of food that they're taking in. In addition, there are several 100 million people in the world today who are well-nourished, but live in countries that import much of their food. That includes some very wealthy countries in East Asia, like Japan and Taiwan and South Korea. Also, most of the countries in North Africa and the Middle East. Another 300 million people there. And in addition, there are about 1 billion people in China who are well-nourished today, but who have not shared in the very rapid economic growth in China over the last 3 decades, are quite poor, and would also, we believe, be at risk in the event of a global nuclear famine following a limited regional nuclear war. And all told, we've concluded in our studies that up to 2 billion people worldwide would be at risk of starvation as a result of a limited regional war confined to India and Pakistan, or any other similar war of similar size. The death of 2 billion people is not the end of our species, but it is almost certainly the end of modern civilization. No civilization in human history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there's no reason to think that modern industrial civilization would do so. This is a limited war. We need to talk about a big war, too. We have been taught since 1990 that the U.S. and Russia are not adversaries and that we don't need to worry about this. And we've kind of embedded that thinking into our way we look at the world. But we know that's not true anymore. Over the last few years, there's been increasing tension between the United States and Russia. And there's a very real possibility that there will be armed conflict between them, and that conflict could escalate to nuclear war. So let's look at what a war involving their arsenals would be like. And I want to start by describing a large-scale attack on a city, not one little bomb like Hiroshima, but what would happen today. We don't know for sure what the targeting strategy of either the U.S. or Russia is, but from what is available in the open literature, I think it is probable that a city like, say, Washington would be hit with 10 to 20 nuclear warheads, each about 30 to 40 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. I'm going to use a model to describe this that posits a single 20 megaton explosion in Washington. just because it's a lot easier to talk about one bomb going off than a whole bunch of them all over the city. The destruction the scenario that I'm using actually underestimates the destruction that would result from more bombs, smaller bombs going off all around the city. But I think it gives an adequate estimation of what we're dealing with. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this bomb, a fireball would form reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this area, the temperature would rise to 20 million degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than the surface of the sun, and everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would just disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude destroy anything that human beings build. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. To a distance of 10 miles in every direction, the winds would still be in excess of 200 miles per hour. Forces of that magnitude would level wooden buildings, masonry buildings. A building like this, modern steel and concrete building, would see the walls, the floors, the ceiling swept out. A steel skeleton would be left behind. To a distance of 16 miles in every direction, notice I've had to change the scale of the map to accommodate this increasing circle of destruction. To 16 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, heating oil, gasoline would all combust. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. The bacteria and the viruses would die. The area would be sterilized of all life. And if this were part of a large-scale war between the United States and Russia, this same level of destruction would be visited on every major city in the United States and every major city in Russia, and if NATO got dragged into the war, every major city in Europe as well. A study that we published in 2002 showed that if only 300 of the warheads in the Russian arsenal got through to targets in the United States, something between 75 and 100 million people would die in the first half hour. The entire economic infrastructure on which all of us depend would be destroyed. And over the months following this initial attack, the vast majority of the American population would also die from exposure, from starvation, from radiation poisoning, from epidemic disease. Same thing would happen in Russia. Altogether, maybe 500 million people dead from the direct effects. But again, this is only part of the story. A war in South Asia drops global temperatures about 1.3 degrees centigrade on average across the planet. A large-scale war between the United States and Russia drops temperatures an average of 8 degrees centigrade across the entire planet. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures drop 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. That's like 50 degrees Fahrenheit on average. In the Northern Hemisphere, the temperate regions, there would be 2 to 3 years in which there would not be a single day free of frost. The temperature would go below freezing for at least some point of every single day. And under those conditions, ecosystems would collapse, food production would stop, and it is probable that the vast majority of the human race would starve to death. It is possible we would become extinct as a species. This is not just some nightmare scenario that I have cooked up to cast a pall over this meeting. This is a real and present danger that we face every day. We know now of at least 6 incidents during the nuclear weapons era. 5 of them are listed here, and one we just found out about after I made this slide. 6 incidents in which either Moscow or Washington prepared to launch nuclear war in the mistaken belief that the other side had already done so. And the most recent of these, as you can see on the date there, January 25th, 1995, was well after the end of the Cold War. These are the incidents that are in the public domain that we know about. There have almost certainly been others. And so the destruction that I talked about is not just some fantasy. This is the danger that we face every day. This is the future that will be if we don't take action, because eventually our luck is going to run out and something horrible is going to happen. But this is not the future that needs to be. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. They are something we have built with our hands, and we know how to take them apart. We've taken apart thousands of them. What is missing is the political will to disarm, to get rid of the rest of these arsenals. And there is a fierce resistance to doing this on the part of the countries which have nuclear weapons. They view these as significant extensions of their national power, and they are not willing to give them up. Fortunately, there are many people around the world and a real movement focused on the non-nuclear weapon states that is determined to ending this situation. As Alice mentioned in her introductory remarks, we've come together in the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapon, a global campaign involving over 490 NGO organizations in 95 countries across the planet, and working with over 130 non-nuclear weapon states, trying to bring about legally binding steps that will end the nuclear weapons era. This movement is led in large part by young people, mainly in Europe, but also in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, and increasingly in Latin America, and increasingly now in North America. And this movement is going to have, I believe, a very major success next month, when a resolution will be tabled at the United Nations General Assembly calling for the commencement of negotiations next year on a treaty to ban nuclear weapons, to define their possession as being illegal, a step which the non-nuclear weapon states believe will put significant pressure on the nuclear powers to meet their obligations to get rid of their nuclear arsenals. That vote will be at the UN, initial preliminary vote in October, final vote in November or December. The nuclear weapon states will be fiercely opposing this effort. They're going to lose. We know that the votes are there. But getting this treaty negotiation to begin is just the next step. We here in the United States in particular, and in the other nuclear weapons states, need to figure out how to take advantage of this new international norm that is being created that says nuclear weapons are not a status symbol, but the badge of a rogue nation. We need to figure out how to take advantage of this new international norm to force our governments to come together in the next stage, which is the negotiation for a nuclear weapons convention, a definitive treaty that sets forth the timeline and the mechanism for an enforceable, verifiable elimination process that gets us to a world that is truly free of nuclear weapons. The world is facing a very, very stark choice. We are either going to get rid of these weapons in the very near future, or they are going to destroy our civilization and everything that we've inherited from our ancestors and everything that we should pass on to our children. And I think we need to think long and hard about this. Many of you are engaged in all kinds of other very important work, and I do not mean to tell you in any way that you should stop doing that. I mean, I work still full-time as a doctor. I don't spend all of my time talking about nuclear weapons. But all of us need to figure out how to make the prevention of nuclear war a part of our life. And every morning when we wake up, we have to ask ourselves, what am I going to do today so that this doesn't happen, so that our children can live? Thank you very much.